So the last couple of weeks, we kind of started with the basics. We talked about what is apologetics. We talked about the difference between biblical faith and blind faith. And last week, we talked about truth. Now, just a little bit of a heads up. While those are all supremely important topics, I think at that point we were still kind of on the surface. And from this class onwards, we're going to start going a little bit deeper, okay? So it's going to start getting a little technical, but don't be intimidated by that. That's a good thing, because we're going deeper into the Christian faith. And today we're going to be talking about logic. I'm going to walk you through some very fundamentals of logical thinking and why this is important for us as Christians. At any point, if you feel like it's starting to get hazy, it's starting to go over your head, just call time out. Just ask me to explain that again, and I'm happy to do that for you, okay? So, what is logic? Logic is that branch of philosophy that is responsible for establishing the laws of argumentation. Logic is a branch of philosophy that is responsible for establishing the laws of argumentation. It governs the world of reason by distinguishing between acceptable and unacceptable forms of argumentation. Okay? So logic is an entire structure. It's a rhetorical structure within which you can gauge the validity of the sorts of arguments that people are making. And a lot of times, especially in our culture where we're very moved by personality and charisma and things like that, you hear somebody say something and you're like, wow, yeah, that actually sounds like he knows what he's talking about. When in reality, if you actually examine their argument, it's full of holes. It's got all kinds of problems to it. It's got all kinds of reasoning errors. And as Christians, if we learn to understand how to identify logical flaws and errors, we will immediately be able to identify what the problem is in that person's argument. Does that make sense? So that's what we're going to learn to do today. So let me give you an example of a formal argument. Okay, so premise 1 says that all Christians worship Jesus. Premise 2, John is a Christian. Conclusion, therefore, John worships Jesus. Everybody with me so far? Okay, this is the most basic logical structure of reasoning. Let me run that by you again. Premise 1, all Christians worship Jesus. This should be a universal fact. Premise 2, John is a Christian. Conclusion, therefore John worships Jesus. Now, for this to be a valid argument, one thing needs to be certain. The premises must be true. If the premises are true, the conclusion will naturally follow. Does that make sense? Have I lost anybody so far? Everybody with me? Okay. If the premises are true, the conclusion will logically follow. So when you hear an argument like this, the first thing you have to ask yourself is, let's examine the premises. Premise 1, is it true that all Christians worship Jesus? Okay. Ideally, yes, it is true. If you're really a Christian, you would worship Jesus. Premise 2, this person is a Christian. Do we know if John is a Christian? Those of you who actually know him and have a relationship with him will know, yes, he is a Christian. So we know the above two premises are true. Therefore, we can be absolutely certain that John worships Jesus. All right? So for this to be a valid argument, the premises must be true, and then the conclusion will logically follow. Let's do another example. Premise 1, vegetables are good for us. Premise 2, a carrot is a vegetable. Therefore, carrots are good for you. There you go. See, simple enough. Okay? Let's do one more. Premise 1, humans are moral beings. Premise 2, Josh is a human. Conclusion? Therefore, Josh is a moral being. Logic. Simple, clear logic. Okay? Now, some of you are probably thinking, okay, this is very nice, it's very fancy, very technical, this is great. what does this have to do with the Christian faith? The laws of logic and reasoning help us identify faulty arguments that distort the truth and help us bring clarity to issues that we may need to engage with. Let me read that again. The laws of logic and reasoning help us identify faulty arguments that distort the truth and help us bring clarity to issues that we may need to engage with. Like I said earlier, a lot of times in our culture, as we engage with different people, or when we watch the news, or when we listen to talk shows, we hear all kinds of reasoning, and some of it seems very persuasive. Some of it seems like, man, yeah. But if you put their argument through your prism of logic, you will actually realize it doesn't look as solid as it is, because once you flip it around, it's thin. It's like a card. It's a house of cards that will just collapse. All right? So that's what we want to do, is we want to learn the laws of argumentation so that we can identify issues like that. Okay, now, what does this mean for us theologically? For example, the following argument is a common tactic that's used by skeptics to debunk the existence of God. This is a very age-old argument. It's a logical argument. So let me put it up here for you. Oh, I'm sorry about that. Actually, I wanted to share with you, what the Apostle Paul says in 2 Corinthians, right? We demolish arguments and every pretension that sets itself up against the knowledge of God, and we take captive every thought to make it obedient to Christ. Yeah, the point I meant to say, to go with the slide, was actually that we actually have a biblical mandate to do this. We're not doing this just because it's a good idea. We're doing it because it's a scriptural mandate, all right? We demolish arguments and every pretension that sets itself up against the knowledge of God, and we take captive every thought to make it obedient to Christ. Logic is a part of your arsenal with which you demolish arguments and with which you take arguments captive. Arguments that distort the truth, arguments that trivialize faith, arguments that distort the perspective of God. We're going to take all those things, we're going to deconstruct it with the truth of God, with the logic, and then we're going to bring that to the obedience of Christ. Because anything and everything that is true has to still fall at the feet of Christ. Amen? Okay, so that's what we need to do. All right, so let's examine some arguments here. This is a very age-old argument. Premise 1. A God who is powerful would be able to destroy evil. Premise 2. A God who is good would desire to destroy evil. Premise 3. But evil still exists. Conclusion. Therefore, God does not exist. At first glance, this sounds like a very reasonable argument. In fact, it sounds so reasonable that it's actually been pretty valid for centuries. People have been using this argument for centuries. Skeptics have been saying this for a long time. If you actually think about it, it does sound kind of persuasive, right? They're saying, wait, if God is powerful, he'd be able to do something about evil. If God is good, he would want to do something about evil, but evil exists. So why on earth would we think there is a God? A lot of people will point to evil to make the claim that God does not exist. Because this is the argument that's at the back of their minds. You see what I'm saying? This is the logical structure from which they're operating. They're saying, look, there's way too much evil around me. It could not be. It could not be that there's a God. If there was a God, there would be no evil. What would we say to a person like this? What would we say to a person who sounds extremely rational, whose argument even seems to make sense, and who's got the most powerful evidence on their side? Premise 3 is a powerful evidence. Even Christians can't debate that. We look around us and evil is all around us. How do you have a conversation with a person like this? Let's examine the premises to see if they actually hold up. Now remember, I said a few minutes ago that if we want to accept the conclusion, we have to examine the premises. Right? So let's examine it. Why is it true that a God who's powerful would be able to destroy evil? Theoretically, yes, of course, it is true, but it is also true that he may have good reasons for withholding his power. Why should we admit to the argument that a God who's powerful will use his power all the time? Where did that come from? Why would that person assume that? God may have good reasons for withholding his power. Reason number 2, that's an argument against premise 2. God may have good reasons for not intervening. He's good. He sees that something bad is going on. He could do something about it. But he may have good reasons to wait this one out. We don't know that. There are gaps in there that we don't know, we don't immediately have the answers to. So this is a jump, right? This is a jump. Now the premise 3, of course, is true. Nobody's gonna debate that. Of course evil exists. But remember what we said. Even if one premise is false in a logical argument, the conclusion does not follow. All premises have to be true in order for a logical argument to stand on its own. Alright? The ability to identify faulty arguments against Christianity will equip us to better engage the culture and showcase the truth of the Christian faith. The reason I keep hammering this point again and again is I want us to draw the connection between rational forms of thinking and the Christian truth. They go hand in hand. We're going to come back to that point later, to that skeptical argument later, and we'll talk a little bit more about it. This is why, as Christians, we need logic as one of our tools in our arsenal. Without it, we will be unable to filter through the unreasonable rhetoric of the culture. Now, here's the thing. This is the fascinating part. I want to show you, I want to demonstrate to you a beautiful narrative in Scripture where Jesus uses logic to dismantle the arguments made by the religious leaders. Now, I know Sean mentioned one he mentioned one in the video, but I want to show you a different one, okay? I don't think I have a slide for this, but maybe I do. Oh, yes, I do. Okay, so this is Matthew chapter 21, verses 23 to 27. If you guys want to pull it up on your Bible, that's fine. If you want to look it up, I know some of you back there may not be able to read the text over here, but I'll read it for you. Verse 23 onwards. Jesus entered the temple courts, and while he was teaching, the chief priests and the elders of the people came to him. By what authority are you doing these things? They asked. And who gave you this authority? Jesus replied, all right, let me ask you a question. If you answer me, I will tell you by what authority I'm doing these things. John's baptism, where did it come from? Was it from heaven or of human origin? Now, at this point, this is funny, right? They discussed it among themselves and said, if we say from heaven, he'll ask, then why didn't you believe him? But if we say of human origin, we're afraid of the people, for they all hold that John is a prophet. So you see, they're stuck, right? They're in a dilemma. So they answered Jesus, they said, we don't know. And then Jesus said, well, then neither will I tell you by what authority I do these things. It's so easy to read a passage like that and miss the logic in there. Okay, so I'm actually gonna break it down for you. So Jesus is questioned about his authority. He knows that if he just comes out and claims to be God, they will condemn him. So to avoid this, he actually, yes. This is Matthew chapter 21, verse 23 to 27. So to avoid this, he sets up a logical dilemma from which they will have to conclude for themselves that his authority comes from God. So he forces them to affirm that John's authority came from God. Okay, just stay with me here. I'm going to do this real slow so you can see it. Pay close attention to this. Verse 26 already tells us that everyone believed that John was a prophet. In John chapter 3, 31 to 36, John himself claimed that Jesus' authority came from God. So to question John's authority or Jesus' authority would be equivalent to questioning God's authority. You see the setup, the logical setup, the dilemma there. If they say, well, yeah, we agree, John's authority did come from God, then they have to believe what he said about Jesus. If they say it didn't come from God, that would be like a death warrant for them, because everybody believes that John was a prophet. So they're stuck. So let me take that. So what I did was I took that scripture and I actually put it into the form of a logical argument. So let's examine what that would look like. Premise 1, all authority comes from God. Nobody in the first century would debate that. Okay? All authority comes from God. Premise 2, therefore a prophet's authority comes from God. People took prophets very seriously back then. Premise 3, John the Baptist was a prophet. Premise 4, John confirmed Jesus was a prophet. Conclusion, therefore, Jesus' authority came from God. Now, in order to disprove the conclusion, what do we need to examine? All the premises. Let's look at the premises and see if they're all true. Does all authority come from God? Yes. Does a prophet's authority come from God? Absolutely. Was John the Baptist a prophet? Absolutely. Did John confirm that Jesus was a prophet? Yes, he did. We know that from John chapter 3, verse 31 to 36. All the premises are true. The conclusion has to follow. You see the logic here. This is why the religious leaders were stuck. They didn't know what to do. And when they said, Jesus, well, we don't know, what did Jesus say? Then I won't tell you where this authority comes from either. Well, I actually thought about that, and I thought, well, why would Jesus say that? One small part of me thinks, almost sounds like a little bit of a petty response. But the truth of the matter is, the reason Jesus said that is because when you examine it like this, which I believe that those religious leaders thought about this, what did they say in the end? They said, I don't know. They said, we don't know. What is that? That's a denial of the truth. In your head, you put the logic together, you came to the conclusion this man has to be who he says he is, but we're too proud to admit it. So we're going to say, we don't know. And Jesus saw that. He saw their hearts. He saw the denial in their hearts. He saw the stubbornness in their hearts. And he said, okay, you put that together in your head. You know the truth, and you're still denying it. I am not obligated to give you a response then, because your hearts are too hardened. See that? Anybody with me? Anybody unclear about any of this? Is there any question here? If I'm going too fast, definitely let me know. I'm happy to slow down. I'm happy to explain it again. Everybody good? Okay, cool. This type of argument is called a deductive argument. So what are deductive arguments? Deductive arguments are arguments that flow from a general principle to a particular condition. Okay, they start out big and they go small. They start out general and they go really particular. They also provide facts and information to establish the conclusion, and as a result of that, the conclusion naturally follows. So in this example, the general principle would be the statement that all authority comes from God. See, that's the general principle, right? And what's the particular? Therefore, Jesus' authority came from God. See how it went from general to particular? That's the form of a deductive argument. Okay? We use deductive reasoning all the time in research, in studies, in news reports, and things like that. Let me give you another example. Generally, cigarettes contain nicotine. Nicotine can be absorbed by your lungs. They can harm your lungs, causing cancer. Therefore, cigarette smoking is bad for you specifically. Therefore, cigarette smoking is bad for you specifically. See how we started with a general principle, and we came down to the particular. That's deductive reasoning, okay? Let's look at, actually, let me go back there for a second. If you have a Bible, turn with me to 2 Peter chapter 1, verses 3 to 8. Sorry, I don't have a slide for that. That was my bad. was supposed to put it up there and I missed it. 2 Peter chapter 1, verses 3 to 8. I'm going to read it for you. 5 verses. We're going to see God using deductive reasoning. Okay? His divine power has given us everything we need for a godly life through our knowledge of Him who called us by His own glory and goodness. Through these, He has given us His very great and precious promises, so that through them you may participate in the divine nature, having escaped the corruption of the world caused by evil desires. For this very reason, make every effort to add to your faith goodness, and to goodness knowledge, and to knowledge self-control, and to self-control perseverance, and to perseverance godliness, and to godliness mutual affection, and to mutual affection love. Here's the particular. For if you possess these qualities in increasing measure, they will keep you from being ineffective and unproductive in your knowledge of our Lord Jesus Christ. Now, I know there was a lot over there, but if you actually write down or look at that entire scripture in front of you, and look at those first 6 verses, it starts with general principles. God's power, God's glory, His goodness, His promises, your participation in the divine nature, and then it comes down, it dovetails, right? It comes down to the particular. For this very reason, if you make an effort to add to your faith, then all these things will come. And if you possess these qualities in increasing measure, they will keep you from being ineffective and unproductive. You see the deductive reasoning there? So there's another type of argument called inductive argument or inductive reasoning. Inductive reasoning generally flows from the particular to the general. It goes the other way. It doesn't always provide the necessary information, which means what? The conclusion doesn't necessarily follow. That's inductive reasoning. I'll give you an example to help you understand that. Premise 1. This book is from that shelf. Premise 2. This book is a science book. Premise 3. Conclusion. All books, therefore, on that shelf are science books. You see the problem with that? You guys see it? This is inductive reasoning. So, you will find that it goes from the particular, which is this book, to the general. See how it goes the other way? The conclusion is overgeneralized, right? The premises might be true, but the conclusion doesn't follow. And this is the exact problem with the argument that we saw earlier against God. Let's look at that again. A God who is powerful would be able to destroy evil. What is the assumption here? That if He's able, He should all the time. Why would you assume that? There's missing information there. God may have good reasons for not doing it. Premise 2, a God who is good would desire to destroy evil. Of course He desires to destroy evil, but that doesn't mean that He immediately does what He desires. God desires for all people to be saved. What is that, 2 Timothy, I think? Does He can do it, right? Like right now He could do it. Like that, He could do it. He hasn't done it. He has His reasons for not doing it. Why would we assume those things and interject an obligation upon God and say, therefore you didn't do it, therefore you don't exist? You see, there's missing information here. It's inductive reasoning. And the conclusion is a major jump. It jumps from the character attributes of God to the existence of God. That's a category jump. It's one thing to talk about the nature and the personality of God. It's an entirely other thing to talk about whether God even exists. At best, you can make the argument, maybe. At best, you can try to squeeze in the argument that if God's not doing these things, He's just a bad God. But why would you come to this conclusion? This doesn't even follow logically. Do you see it? It doesn't follow. This is why it's crucial to understand the formal structures of reasoning and the laws of logic. Because without it, we won't be equipped to deal contradictions of the culture. Ladies and gentlemen, you will hear arguments like this in different forms all the time. Christina, you brought one up a few weeks ago. Is God so powerful? No, that's not how you said it. You said, can God create a rock so heavy that he cannot lift? How many of you have heard this one before? Think about it. The first time I heard that, I was like, I don't know. But then I realized something. Wait a minute, there's lots of missing information in there. Logic is a universal truth of the world. Even God does not violate the laws of logic. Even God cannot create a square circle. It's a logical contradiction. C.S. Lewis says this, right? He says, nonsense cannot become possible just because you add the words God can. Mm-hmm. You see what he's saying? You can't attribute nonsense to God and expect to get meaning and coherence out of it just because you put God at the beginning of that sentence. It's very true, isn't it? In fact, as Christians, we can say there are a lot of things God cannot do. God cannot lie. God cannot sin. God cannot commit evil. God cannot be logically contradictory to his nature and being. If we pay attention, we'll be able to see these contradictions all around us every day in news reports, talk shows, comedy routines, blogs, articles, websites, you name it. So if we don't identify it, we won't catch it. And if we don't catch it, we will fall for it. We'll fall for it. There are lots of people who fall for it all the time. Because we hear a really good argument, a little young kid who kind of grew up in a little bubble in his church, who wasn't exposed to any sort of, critical thinking, goes off to some Ivy League college somewhere, and this really smart PhD professor stands up in front of him and throws something out like that, and it shakes him to his core. His whole faith gets shaken because it sounds so smart. But if he was only equipped with the rudimentary skills of logical thinking and critical thought, he would be immediately able to identify what the problem is with that reasoning and be like, hold on, time out. The conclusion doesn't follow. And here are reasons why it doesn't follow. Okay? So we need to be able to think critically about the things that the culture is saying. Speaking of bad arguments that the culture makes, these are actually called logical fallacies. Fallacies. I'm going to show you the definition here in a little bit. I actually want to run through I want to give you a few examples of fallacies so that you know exactly what I'm talking about. Okay, so what is a logical fallacy? It is an error in reasoning that makes an argument invalid. Okay, it is an error in reasoning that makes an argument invalid. So in a fallacious argument, the conclusion never follows. Why? Because there's all kinds of twists and confusion with the premises. There's all kinds of assumptions, there's all kinds of generalizations, there's all kinds of deception in the premises, and because it's contaminated, because the argument is contaminated with all those things, the conclusion almost never follows. So let me show you an example of some common logical fallacies. This fallacy is called ad hominem. So basically in Latin it means to the man. So when someone attacks the character, personality, or motive of the person making the argument, instead of addressing the argument itself. Okay, so let me give you an example. Let me pick on John here. So when John comes up to me after class, and he's like, Prashant, you're really bombing this class, dude. This is really, you need to work on some of these areas. That's why we have so many empty seats now, because it's a disaster. I think here are some areas that you could improve on to make this class better. Okay? And if I turned around to him and said, listen, buddy, just because you don't understand what I'm teaching doesn't mean you get to tell me how I should run this class. Just because it's going over your head doesn't mean that I need to change everything. Ad hominem. What did I do? Instead of listening to his argument, instead of actually saying, okay, all right, brother, sit down. Let me hear you out. What's your point? Let's sit down and discuss what are the things I could improve on. That would be paying attention to his argument. Instead of doing that, what did I do? I attacked him personally. I questioned his intelligence. You see that? That's an ad hominem fallacy. This happens all the time. All the time. Right? Those of us who have kids, this happens all the time with our kids. He took this thing and you took this thing from me and you should give it back. Yeah, but you smell ugly. Whatever. What does that have to do with anything? Okay? So when someone attacks the character, personality, or motive of the person making the argument, instead of addressing the argument itself, that fallacy is called an ad hominem fallacy. Everybody get that? Okay. Let's do another one. This fallacy is called an appeal to unqualified authority. When someone appeals to an individual who is not a credible authority or expert on a particular subject, that is called an appeal to unqualified authority. So there's this one guy, I actually like watching certain talk shows for one particular reason. I actually like to listen to the fallacious arguments they make. One, it just has great entertainment value, it just keeps me laughing. But for the second reason is, you actually get to see how the culture thinks. Right? So one guy I actually listen to, on and off, is this talk show host called Bill Maher. Okay? Some of you may know who Bill Maher is. Now, Bill Maher does this all the time. He'll invite a celebrity. And he'll have that celebrity give an opinion on some political issue, or some foreign policy issue, or something like that. So one clip that's actually gone pretty viral on YouTube is actually a clip where he invites this guy called Sam Harris and Ben Affleck. You all know Ben Affleck, the guy who was never supposed to be Batman. But yes, he's in that clip. Yes, amen. Thank you. Yes, Christian Bale all the way. So Sam Harris is an atheist, but he's a very intellectual guy. He's very sharp. He's actually studied about religions. He knows what he's talking about. And Ben Affleck just jumps all over him because he says that the majority of the radical Islamic terrorist attacks and all that comes from the Islamic faith, which is true. It's true. It's not even debatable. It's true. Ben Affleck gets so offended, he jumps all over him. He's like, this is gross, this is racist, and all these things, and he just explodes. Here's my question. Why is Ben Affleck commenting on a world religion? He doesn't know what he's talking about. But see, this happens all the time. Bill Maher will invite some random celebrity and have them give an opinion on something, which has nothing to do with it. They're not an expert, or they have no knowledge in that field at all. But the culture thinks, oh, Kim Kardashian, I like her. What she's saying must be true. Why? Because I like her. That's terrible reasoning. This happens all the time, yes.
I had a feeling, though, that you could find an expert that would mirror what Ben Affleck said.
Probably. And that's okay. The question is not about the content of what they're saying. The question is, are they credible authority on the subject? If you have a person who is a credible authority on the subject and comes to the same conclusion as Ben Affleck, then the argument is different. The argument is, what's the nature of his argument, and what's the nature of the conclusion he's coming to? That's not the point of the fallacy. The point of the fallacy is to say that the person who's making the argument has no expertise in that field, which means there's no, on what basis are they even commenting on this? That's the fallacy. You see what I'm saying? It's not about the final conclusion that they come to. It's about on what basis are you commenting on that. Now, nobody's saying you shouldn't have an opinion. That's not the point of this fallacy. Of course, anybody can have an opinion. But the fallacious reasoning is that just because you have an opinion and just because you're somebody famous doesn't mean we should take you at face value. That's the point of this fallacy. Okay? So this happens all the time. This was several months ago. Katy Perry was invited to some major, I forget what, I think it was like some G8 summit meeting or something like that. And she gave a lecture on foreign policy. Katy Perry. Now, not to politicize this too much, but while the left does this a lot, we're not, the right is not immune to it either. So a couple of months ago, Kim Kardashian was invited to the White House. For what? To speak on prison reform. What does Kim Kardashian know about prison reform? Why is Kim Kardashian in the White House talking to the President of the United States about prison reform? Why are we obsessed with this celebrity culture? We have this idea that, okay, this person is famous, they're successful, hey, they must have done something right, that's why they're successful, so we should take them seriously. That is not a valid grounds for believing them. Okay? Now, you actually bring up a good point. So if a qualified authority, so let's say, I don't know, I can't think of an example right now, but if an actual person who is rubbing shoulders with ambassadors, who's sitting and drafting foreign policy, geopolitical conversations and how to come to agreements on certain foreign policy issues. If a person like that comes to the White House and then has something to say, even if that person says something absolutely stupid, the point of the matter is at least they're qualified to speak on the issue. You see the argument, okay? And when people come up randomly, just because they're celebrities, just because they're famous, and they come and say all kinds of things, we can't take them seriously for this reason. But this is very common in our culture. We think that if a person is famous, if a person is successful, they can just speak on any issue and we should take them seriously. The point here is not that they don't have an opinion. Anybody and everybody can have an opinion. The point is, are they qualified enough that we should take them seriously on that opinion? Okay? All right, move on. The next one, this fallacy is called a straw man. When an argument is intentionally misrepresented and then its credibility is attacked based on the misrepresentation. So what's a straw man? Scarecrow. Okay? It's literally scarecrow. What we do is we take a human being and we kind of deconstruct them to make them look like a scarecrow, and then we say, look at this human. This is how silly human beings are. That's the meaning of this. You don't take a thought or a religion or something at its face value. You insult it, or you humiliate it, or you twist it, or you pervert it, and then you use the perversion to discredit it. Okay, that's what a straw man means. So let me give you an example. If someone argues that Christianity is a false religion because it contains stories of talking snakes and donkeys, that is a straw man because it is a misrepresentation of the Christian faith. Does that make sense? I've actually heard someone say this. How can you believe in a religion that actually thinks that a snake spoke to human beings in the garden, or that a donkey spoke? It's ridiculous. I mean, and I'm sitting there thinking, is that all you think Christianity is? See, it's too reductive, right? They're taking the Christian faith, they're maligning it, they're twisting it, they're reducing it down to some small components, and then they're using that to trivialize or attack the Christian faith. This is called a straw man argument. Here's another one. When the president says that we need to spend less on the defense budget, And the Democrats argue that the president doesn't care about leaving our nation defenseless. Did you catch that? What did the president say? The president is saying our defense budget is too high. We need to cut it down. He has several reasons for why that needs to come down. And what did the opposite camp say? They're saying, you don't care about the people outside the border. You don't care about just leaving us defenseless. You're gonna tie up our hands and anybody can attack us. You don't care about the people at all. That was not even the point of the argument. You see, it's a twisting of the issue. Thanks for coming, Jason. It's a twisting of the issue, right? They took the core issue, they twisted it, they perverted it, and then they're using that to attack the whole thing.
You gotta run that back to me there.
This one?
Yeah, this thing about what you just said about
Okay, so,
more money to the defense.
oh yeah. So when the president says that we need to spend less on the defense budget,
I thought he said more.
no, spend
Oh,
less.
okay.
Reduce the defense budget. When the president wants to reduce the amount of money that we're spending on the national defense, and the liberals or the Democrats argue, well, you don't care about the safety of the nation. See, it's rhetoric, right? It's very sensationalistic arguments, but it's a twisting of the issue. All right? Okay, here's another one. Appeal to pity. When a person tries to invoke the pity or the sympathies of the individual instead of focusing on the issue itself. So, for example, like I said, it happens on both sides of the party, so I'm going to be impartial here. During President Obama's regime, when he first unveiled his plan for the Affordable Care Act, Republicans responded by stating that millions would die because he didn't care about the average folk. Now, here's the thing. Again, not to get into politics, the reason even when I was making these notes, I was thinking to myself, I don't want to use so many political examples. But the problem is that actually the reason I decided to do it is because politics is so front and center for all of us right now that it's probably the issue we can all resonate with right away because we're hearing it all the time. And I wanted you guys to be able to see it immediately. Okay? That's why I'm using a lot of political examples. So what's the problem with this? President Obama first unveiled his Affordable Care Act plan, and Republicans responded by saying millions will die because of this. Now, it's one thing to say, here are the particular problems with the policy. That would be different. But if we respond by saying, if we're trying to appeal to the pity of the American public, or the sympathies of the American public, and say, look, he doesn't care about the people. You're not addressing the issue. You're trying to invoke their emotions in trying to gain brownie points by appealing to the emotions. Does that make sense? Some of you are probably thinking, what's wrong with that? What's wrong with appealing to the emotions? In principle, nothing. In principle, nothing. The point of the argument is that when we are making a particular argument, we should discuss it on the merits of the argument. That's the point of this. This actually goes the other way too. Like when it comes to like pro-life issues, for example. If somebody says the woman should be allowed to have an abortion because if she doesn't, it's going to be something that she has to live with for the rest of her life. It's going to affect her finances. She's not going to be able to get a job. She's not. They paint this picture of this very, very difficult life that a woman is going to have. Therefore, it justifies an abortion. Now, could it be true that all of those things might be possible? Yes. Yes. It could be very true that it's going to affect her life. It could be very true that she may struggle to get a job. It could be very true that she may financially struggle. All of these things could be true. But the point of the matter is it justified terminating a baby? See, when you ask that question, now you're not hovering over the sympathies anymore. You're coming straight to the heart of the issue. What is the unborn child? That's the heart of the argument. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So we have to be careful when any sort of reasoning and argumentation is made, and there's a lot of appeal to pity and sympathy in there. We have to have that ability to be like, okay, there's a lot of appeal to my emotions. I can feel my heartstrings being pulled. But just for a second, is it possible to kind of set our emotions to the side and be objective about what is the real issue here? Now, sometimes that's hard to do. Sometimes it's hard to do because emotions are powerful. But that's why they appeal to it. Emotions are powerful. That's why they appeal to emotions in the first place. And so we have to have that ability to say, wait. Okay, this sounds very emotional. It's really tugging on my heartstrings, but I don't want to be blindsided by my emotions. I want to see if what the person is saying actually makes sense. Okay. So this is called appeal to pity. This is something over here. All right. So another fallacy is called argumentum ad populum. This is otherwise called the bandwagon argument. It is an appeal to the fact that something must be acceptable because everyone is doing it. How many of you have heard this? You hear this all the time. Mom, can I have a piercing? Because all my friends have one. Argumentum ad populum. Is something right just because everybody is doing it? No. This is a fallacious argument. This is a logical fallacy. This fallacy is called the bandwagon argument. The Supreme Court actually did something like this in 1973 with the Roe v. Wade decision that legalized abortion. There was all this public pressure. All of these, it was on the heels of the sexual revolution. There was a lot of things going on in American culture at the time. There's some of you here for whom those memories are fresh. And the Supreme Court caved in. And they were like, everybody wants it. This is not going to be, we just can't fight this. Let's do it. Let's pass it. And they passed it. And then on the heels of that bill passing, there were lots of Americans who were like, you know what? Oh, okay, so I actually should quote you the statistic. So in 1969 or 1971, the percentage of evangelicals who thought that abortion was wrong, was morally wrong, was about 80-something%. In 1975, just 2 years after Roe v. Wade, the percentage of evangelicals who thought it was wrong dropped to just below 60%. That's huge. We went from over 80% to like less than 60% in just a few years. Why? Here's the idea. So there's actually a lot of studies that have showed that American culture has gotten this idea that if something is legal, it means it's moral. You see the connection? So a lot of people, after 1973, when the Supreme Court said, okay, Roe v. Wade is now the precedent, it's now the law of the land, abortion is now legal, a lot of people thought, well, it's legal, so I guess it's okay now. You see, but there's an equivocation between legal and moral. We can't make that equivocation. There's a difference. Just because something is legal doesn't make it moral. Right? But this was a thing. And then everybody thought, well, now that it's legal, everybody's doing it. Okay, I guess abortions are in now. See, but this is at the back of everyone's minds. Everybody's doing it, so it's okay. That's fallacious reasoning. Did you guys get that? Argumentum ad populum. Just because everybody's doing it doesn't mean that it's okay. So that's just a few examples of logical fallacies. There are tons more. I just showed you 5. There are tons of examples. In fact, I don't even know if there's an official count of how many logical fallacies there are. If you Google logical fallacies, you'll find, a lot of times you'll find articles that say things like the 10 most common logical fallacies, or the 15 most frequently used logical fallacies, whatever. So you'll find stuff like that. But I actually looked through the web, and I found it hard to find a place where, I don't know, maybe somewhere out there somebody's done an exhaustive compilation of every logical fallacy possible. I haven't found one so far. The most I found where one person had posted something was there was about 65 fallacies. But I want to say there's probably more. And in some cases, there'll be a couple of fallacies in the same example. So in some cases, you'll find a particular statement that somebody makes, and you'll find the appeal to pity and the straw man fallacy in the same argument. That's very possible too. So then, if you calculate those, then then the list even quadruples even more, right? Why is that? Why is that the case? Here's why. This goes back to the definition of fallacies. Fallacies are errors in reasoning. They're flaws in the way we think. And who are the people doing the thinking? Human beings. Human beings are complex. Human beings are complicated. Our thoughts and our feelings have all kinds of biases to them. We have a way of rationalizing our own sins. We do this all the time. Every one of us in this room, including myself, does it every day. We have this ability to put a spin on things for whatever reason, either to make it palatable to our own conscience, or to make it convenient for any decision we need to make, or to save face. There's all kinds of reasons. That's why it's really hard to round it off to a particular number of fallacies because of the human heart. Does that make sense? The human heart is complex. The human heart is complicated. And we make all kinds of flaws in reasoning all the time. So, I don't know, maybe somewhere out there there's an exhaustive list of every particular fallacy. But yeah, I just wanted to show you guys a few examples. Going back to that 2 Corinthians passage, if we are to demolish every argument that sets itself up against God, and if we need to be ready to give a reason for the hope that is in us, we must learn to reason correctly first. We must understand how logic works. And we must be able to identify the fallacies in the reasoning of the culture. Does that make sense? When we do that, then Christians will become better ambassadors of the culture. I cannot tell you how many stories I've heard of people who heard something, some sort of argument that really moved them a lot, that really shook them up, that they found very persuasive, and it nagged them until it shook up their faith a little bit. It weakened their faith. And when I hear those kinds of stories, I think to myself, if only you could have identified what the fault was in their reasoning, you would have seen it immediately. Genesis chapter 3. You too can become like God. What was that an appeal to? Who wants to take a shot at that? What was that an appeal to? Emotion, yes, in one sense. Self-interest. It was an appeal to self-interest. What's his argument? God's keeping something from you, dude. You think you have it all. You don't have it all. There's more. Take a bite. There's more. It was an appeal to self-interest. What was the simple argument against the appeal to self-interest? I don't care if I'm missing out on something. I don't care to become like God or not. God told me to obey. all I need to do is obey. We would not be living in a fallen world if they had seen the powerful flaw in that powerful argument and had rebutted it with just a heart of obedience to God. But they didn't. They swallowed the faulty argument. Okay? So, reasoning is a very powerful thing. Christianity is a rational belief system. We believe in Christianity because Christianity is true. And this is what we're on this journey for. We're going through these classes to examine precisely why Christianity is true. So we're going to examine it from logic. We're going to compare it to other belief systems. We're going to look at some core areas of the Christian faith. And the more and deeper we go through these classes, you are going to be more and more confident and become more and more rational in your understanding and your embrace of the Christian faith. And that will make you powerful ambassadors. It will make you powerful advocates for the faith. When you step out those doors and you see, and somebody walks up to you and throws an argument about, God being good and not God being powerful, and still there's evil and all that, now you're equipped. Now you know. Hold on, dude, time out. Why would you assume that? Where is that premise coming from? A lot of times they don't know how to deal with pushback. See, a lot of atheists I see, and people who I've spoken to even, they just listen to things on the internet. They just listen to all the popular arguments on the internet, but nobody has taken the effort to actually study it and know how to respond. They just know to throw it at you, and then they like to say something that will make the Christian squirm, and then they just sit back and like, yeah, see, you don't know how to answer. We do. There's answers to all of those issues, if we can identify it. That's what this is about. Okay? If you learn how the laws of logic work, if you learn how to reason correctly, you will learn then how to identify a faulty reasoning. I have a friend who is a banker, who's worked as a banker for several years. And I asked him, Sam, did you go through any sort of lesson to identify a faulty, currency note? And he said, no, not really. In theory, yeah, we learned all those things. But the way I can identify is not because of those things I learned. It's because I'm repeatedly using the real thing. The more you use the real thing, the quicker you can identify the faulty one, the fraudulent one. Okay? So we want to expose ourselves to the truth. We want to expose ourselves to the correct reasoning. Sometimes you won't catch it. That's why, in fact, I've given you a handout, but I also encourage you guys to go online and just look up logical fallacies. They're very interesting to read, very fancy to read. Let me give you one more example. We still have a little bit of time. I want to give you guys some time for questions, but I heard a preacher say this a few months ago. He said, this was his case. Okay, this is the argument he made. He said, horses get together and make horses. Christina, this argument might be familiar to you. Cats get together and make cats. Dogs get together and make dogs. The Godhead got together and made gods.
People.
Gods. He said gods. And his argument was, we are little gods. We are little gods. This is actually pretty foundational prosperity theology stuff. We are little gods. And the reasoning he gave for that was, God created us in his own image. We are begotten after God. And if we're begotten after God, we are in a sense like him. Of course, we are little gods, so we're small g. We're not big G like him. We can't do everything that God can do, but we're pretty close. This is pretty much exactly what he said. As soon as he said that, the first thing that struck my mind is he made something that's called an equivocation fallacy. He equivocated. Equivocation means you're using. can go in two ways. You can either attribute one meaning to two different words, or you can use two different words in the same sense. Okay, that's equivocation. The equivocation fallacy he made was to use the word beget and create in the same sense. There's a vast difference. Beget means you reproduce after your own kind. Create means you just make something that resembles something else. Okay? There is only one begotten Son, that is Jesus. Philippians chapter 2. What does it say? Being in very nature God. The Greek word is ousia, essence. Jesus was in very nature God. In very essence, he was God. That's not who we are. We are created in God's image. We're not begotten. See, but that's what he was saying. He was using the word beget and create in the same sense. That's an equivocation fallacy. But what are the consequences of that fallacy? Huge doctrinal consequences. It sounds like a simple argument. It sounds like a simple reasoning. He makes it sound so simple. Horses begets horses. Dogs make dogs. Cats make cats. When the Godhead gets together, what do they make? Little gods. Yes.
Wouldn't there also be the argument of saying you compared all these species as male and female, because that, if you're going by the premise that only a male and female can create an offspring, well, God is not male and female.
Yeah. Yeah, you're right. We are dealing just with the logic of his statement. We're not even going into the meaningfulness of it. There's all kinds of meaninglessness in that argument. I'm just showing you the logical problem of that argument. We're not even going into the truth claims of it. We're not even going into the doctrine and the theology of it. We're not even going into the philosophy of it. If you go to all of those will all be problematic as well. You're right. You're right. So anyways, when he said that, his congregation is like, what, 20, 25,000, 30,000. Everybody cheered. Everybody clapped. And my heart just broke. I'm thinking to myself, it sounds good to your ears. It's tickling your ears to be called a little God. Do you not see the flaw in his reasoning? And they didn't see it. That's why they didn't know. That's why this is deception. They're being deceived. But if you know, wait a minute, you can't use those two words like that. If you were sitting in that congregation and you knew this, you should walk up to him and be like, hey, can you explain this to me? You just used the word beget and create in the same sense. You go to Madame Tussauds Wax Museum. You see all these amazing replicas, right, of real people. Some of them look so real. Like even the attention to detail is fantastic, like freckles and everything. But are they the same thing? No, they just resemble them. Biologically, physiologically, they are not the same.
Because in our culture, we have to use make. That means both create and forget.
Yeah. And so words are powerful. Words are powerful, and we have to be responsible with the way we use words. Okay. So, anyways, that's just 5 examples of logical fallacies. I want to encourage you guys to check out more. Go online, look up different types of logical fallacies. They're very, very interesting. And the more you learn them and understand them, the better you'll be able to identify it when you hear it. And when you hear it, you'll be like, wait a second, here's the problem with that argument. Here's why we shouldn't just take that hook, line, and sinker. And you'll be able to deconstruct what that person is saying. If, like the Apostle Paul said, if the way 2 Corinthians says, we must demolish arguments and every pretension that sets itself up against the knowledge of God, we have to have tools to demolish those arguments. We have to have arsenal with which we can identify those kinds of things. And then you'll become a better and more efficient ambassador of the Christian faith. Okay? Cool. All right. So, technically, we are done. Yeah, you guys are free to leave, but if you have any questions or thoughts or comments, feel free to throw them out, and we can talk about them.